You're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake and Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 on your FM dial. Coming to you now, it's Long Waves with Gary Krug. Expressed on Long Waves are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of KYRF's staff, management, or its underwriters. And thank you for joining me today in this reprieve from summer. It's a gorgeous day outside our studio. I wanted to pick up finally, part two of the show Politics and Politics. And I had Ms. Jones with us, and then we had the fund drive, but now, finally, it's going to happen. And I'm going to be examining a bit of what democracy looks like in the postmodern age. It's kind of hard to know how to start, but on the other hand, it's not, because everywhere I look, I see the signs of a culture and a nation devouring itself. We have created what Henry Giraud and others have referred to as a comprehensive war machine. I don't know if you've seen the news from Aleppo and Syria, or the news about the findings, so-called, of the investigation into MH17, the Malaysian airliner that was shot down over Ukraine 2 years ago. Or if you followed any of the other madness going on. For instance, today, both houses of Congress voted to override President Obama's veto of legislation allowing citizens to sue Saudi Arabia for 9/11. Now, this is interesting because it's sort of hard to know what court they would sue in, but it is at least a sop to the populace. And we have the ongoing murders of young black people in particular around the country continuing at a frightening pace. It seems there are 2 or 3 every time I open my browser. We have created in this country, as I've illustrated before, a culture of war. But it's not just an externalized culture of war, it's an internalized culture of war, which is used to assault women, for example, to close down abortion clinics, for example, to deny women and poor people the right to buy into Medicaid in some states, or Obamacare, as it's sometimes called. We have, as I pointed out, this ongoing war on minority youth. And black people in general. We have, as Giraud points out, war is being waged against these minorities whose everyday behavior is being criminalized, as they are subject to debtor prisons, an expansion of the incarceration state. At the same time, impoverished cities are turned into war zones. And as he points out quite rightly, and as I've noted on the show before, the weapons that we deploy in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan are then given to the police to use here. I don't know what more clearly expresses the physical reality of war coming to America, being a war culture, being consumed by a war culture, than that the police receiving military-style weaponry, armored cars, machine guns, drones, surveillance gear. It's all there. But overwhelmingly, and this is why I found Giraud so interesting, he notes that, quote, war culture arrogantly expresses its disdain for democracy by implementing laws to restrict voting rights, abolishing the social contract, undermining civic institutions, and exhibiting contempt for the common good, public employees, unions, and public goods such as schools. The war on poverty has become a war on the poor, waged by policies that deprive the poor of public provisions, such as food stamps, quality health care, and decent jobs. Where else do we see this war? We see a war on the working class, a war on the middle class, which is common knowledge these days, but it's important. It is important to keep these things in our minds and to give them frames that these are not isolated acts. These are all part of a larger picture. A larger picture of violence, of repression, of surveillance, all of which undermines the entire idea of politics and the entire idea of democracy. You know, if you want to know what democracy is these days in the U.S., well, you can always have recourse to common beliefs, you know, what ordinary folk think. So there is, for instance, on one cheek of the butt of American politics, let's call it the Republican cheek, a common belief that individualism is the most important thing. Individualism. And it's not individualism in the ordinary sense. It's individualism in an Randian sense, an Ayn Randian sense. This is nuts. This is anathema to genuine democracy, which I'll get to in a minute. I'll explain this. But the other cheek of the butt, let's call it the Democratic cheek of the butt of American politics, is that the government should enact equality. Now, I know that sounds odd, but I'm going to explain why pursuing equality is problematic. Okay, so stay with me. Let's think of some examples of some of the people demonstrating various forms of politics in the world. For instance, we could take the Utah Bundys, who are currently undergoing trial for seizing the Malheur Refuge in Oregon last year. Well, the Bundys are an interesting bunch because they simultaneously attack the Constitution and at the very same moment defend their own curious and ahistorical understanding of it. So notice, though, that going out with firearms, that bullying federal employees with firearms, I mean BLM people, for God's sakes, is a complete repudiation of politics. There is no politics there. There is no common good there. There is only the rabid individualism of the Bundys and what they want. So this repudiates politics and moves straight to power. Right, straight to the guns and violence and the threat of violence. So certainly this is one aspect of the rot in contemporary thought about what democracy is. You know, there is there is a commonality through some of the examples I'm going to give, including the Bundys, and that is a failure of politics is perceived by people. Sorry for the passive there. People perceive a failure of politics, and so they turn to other means. So the Bundys, certainly. And then we could take, say, some of the anarchist movements. And in anarchism, they seek to diminish or dissipate all authoritarian power. Any power that doesn't arise directly from human interaction, it should be disposed of. Anything that isn't directly agreed to is illegitimate. And in some cases, this is very close to a Jeffersonian position. And Jefferson was very skeptical of constitutions in general and didn't have a lot good to say about them. He even proposed that the Constitution should expire every 19 years so that the dead would not have control over the living. Well, let's think of another group of people, and these aren't Americans, although they bear some similarities to what's going on in America. The campesinos of Latin America, who are fighting to preserve land that they have held before there was time, which is being threatened by mining companies, logging companies, oil companies, and they do what power does when no one is looking. They send in jackbooted thugs to beat, intimidate, murder, and steal. We've got the same event, same kind of event going on with the Native Americans, Native North Americans over there in South Dakota, who are striving to preserve control of the quality of life, the quality of water, control of their traditional lands against miners and multinationals, and they too have been met with violent reactions. South Dakota, North Dakota, violent reactions. They've had dogs sicked on them. International security firms have been hired to subdue these pesky people who think they have some dominion over their land. Well, when we think about this, people who have recourse to address their issues through politics or through the mechanisms of the courts do not have to resort, generally, to violence, do not have to resort to extra-legal activities, do not have to resort to large demonstrations, which are not extra-legal. There should be completely legal, especially on a people's own land, but the governments of North and South Dakota apparently see this rather differently. In essence, these are responses to a state-sanctioned carnival of cruelty. A state-sanctioned carnival of cruelty. This is anti-politics. This is people's response to repression and voter rigging and corporations buying laws, buying the acquiescence of the police and the governments, as we're seeing playing out big time right now in Brazil, as we're seeing playing out big time here. And we have this very, very curious idea that somehow this individualism that so many Americans want to hold up, I want to get back to the individualism, this individualism which so many Americans want to hold up is a good thing. It is not. I want to read from the chapter 4 of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, published in 1835, and one of the keenest analyses of American people, their nature, and government, much of which remains amazingly true today. Chapter 4, he wrote, quote, "Despotism, which is fearful by nature, looks upon the isolation of men as the surest guarantee of its own duration, and ordinarily does all it can to ensure that isolation." Think about that. Despotism looks upon isolation as the surest guarantee of its own duration. No vice of the human heart suits it better than egoism. A despot will be quick to forgive the people he governs for not loving him, provided they do not love one another. That's key. He does not ask for their help in conducting the state. It is enough that they do not seek to run it themselves. Minds that aspire to combine their efforts to promote the common prosperity, he calls disruptive and restless, and altering the natural meaning of the words, he calls those who keep strictly to themselves good citizens. Good citizens. Individualism, egoism. These are the operational appearances of living in a failed democracy. Living in a failed democracy. People will react to systems that are disrupted. If they can't get justice here, they will get justice someplace else, or they will seek it on their own, sometimes with the point of a gun. You know, one of the issues is we talk a lot about equality. I mentioned equality before, and I know it sounds odd to speak about equality as a very problematic thing. But as de Tocqueville notes, equality places men side by side without a common bond to hold them together. It places people side by side. Despotism raises barriers between them to keep them apart. The former disposes them not to think of their fellow men, and the latter makes a kind of public virtue of indifference. And says despotism, dangerous at all times, is therefore particularly to be feared in democratic centuries. And yet we have this notion of equality. What we actually are looking for, I think, is something more like liberty. Not liberty to do whatever the hell you want, but liberty to participate in a political process. And Sheldon Wolin, the American social philosopher, suggested there were two basic qualities that could be associated with democracy and are indeed necessary for democracy. One is liberty, but the other is equality. Okay. Think about it. Equality as, well, let me quote from the man, Sheldon Wolin. This is from an essay of his called Democratic Theory. Heterogeneity, that is, a mixing pot of people. Heterogeneity is a consequence of liberty and equality, the two values that since antiquity have been associated solely with democracy. As Tocqueville observed, Jacksonian American democratic equality consists in the extraordinary release of human energies, the net result of which is social inequalities arising from individual differences of natural endowment, luck, and circumstance. And the peculiarity of democratic liberty, that it shields anti-democratic forms of power. Corporations are persons that enjoy the same rights as individuals, while its officers acquire immunities denied to ordinary citizens. And the fugitive character of democracy is no mystery. For whereas democratic freedom encourages the expression of diversity, and its attendant fragmentation of the homogeneity signified by the people, some fragments are less fragmented than others. Multiculturalism and multinational corporations are not equivalencies. They are not equivalent. So we've got written into this system that we have a completely, what shall I say, rigged field upon which play takes place. And yet we hold on to this idea of democracy is somehow voting, and that freedom is somehow, liberty is somehow being left alone to do what the hell you want to do, and that this is what constitutes the citizen. You know, everywhere we look at countries like Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, and we say, they are not democracies. We're going to bring them the blessing of democracy. Well, of course, we're not going to do any such thing. We're going to blow the hell out of them, turn them into failed states. But notice how we use this, we beat nations over the head, and we beat our own citizens' consciousness over the head with this notion of democracy as the only true legitimacy for a political system. And as Wolin points out, this modern democracy consists of free elections, free political parties, and free press, and of course, the free market. In fact, generally we put the free market first. The free market is necessary for free speech, as George W. Bush once famously said. And we even look at countries in South America or in the Middle East or in Asia, wherever, and periodically, you know, we send experts to figure out whether they're meeting the requirements of real democracy, especially the part about free markets, which means oligarchs, basically. So, Wolin continues, it is paradoxical. While hardly anyone questions that the self-styled advanced industrialized democracies are really democracies, fewer still care to argue that the people actually rule in any of them, or that it would be a good idea if they did. For in societies where managerial rule is widely practiced, democracy appears as inherently crude and hence unsuited to the task of governing complex and rapidly changing societies. At the same time, in those quarters, it is often declared that democracy demands such a high level of political sophistication from citizens as to make it doubtful that it can be mastered by third world people, or indeed by people in Louisiana or Mississippi or, you know, pick your poison. And people just aren't smart enough. And of course, this leads immediately to managerialism. The people have to be managed. Their ideas have to be controlled. Walter Lippmann, Edward Bernays. This is the New York Times. I mean, this is why we end up with our paper of record being referred to as American Pravda, and not in Russia, here in the U.S. So Woolen continues, and he says, well, what we're actually trying to measure in this claim of democratic legitimacy is not the vitality of democracy, but the degree to which democracy is attenuated, is dialed down, so as to serve other needs, other ends. The most fundamental of these is the establishment and development of the modernizing state. See, it's not, a lot of people say, but it's not that the ancient, the Greek idea of democracy just can't handle the size and scope and scale and complexity of the modern world. Quote, rather, it is that any conception of democracy grounded in the citizen as actor and politics as episodic is incompatible with the modern role of the state as the fixed center of political life. And the corollary conception of politics as continuous activity organized around a single dominating objective, control of or influence over the state apparatus. Control of or influence over the state apparatus. And this is really not representing you or me. This is about getting involved in some kind of managerial democracy, managerial government. Well, it says democracy needs to be reconceived as something other than a form of government, as a mode of being that is conditioned by bitter experience, doomed to succeed only temporarily, but is a recurrent possibility as long as the memory of the political survives. Democracy is a political moment, he writes, perhaps the political moment, when the political is remembered and recreated. Democracy is a rebellious moment that may assume revolutionary, destructive proportions, or may not. When we hear a lot about restoring democracy, restoring freedom, restoring America. And it's funny how they all rely on the powers of the modern state. They all rely on the powers of this centralized monolith, this labyrinth of government that we have created. And how we're going to renew everything, make America great again? By using the powers of the modern state? Really? There is a possibility of renewal. And as Woolen notes, it's the possibility of renewal is that ordinary individuals are capable of creating new cultural patterns of commonality, new cultural patterns of being together at any moment. And this gets to the heart of what politics is. It's living with others. It is negotiating in this heterogeneity, in this fruit salad of people and beliefs and ideas. That is politics. It's not going out every 2 years and voting or mailing your ballot back in, which half of Americans don't bother to do anyway. They look at Hillary and they look at Trump and they say, is this American politics? Yuck. And they go back and watch reruns of the Golden Girls or whatever they watch. The millennials are turned off in droves. Lots of people are turned off in droves because the system as it exists is dysfunctional. It is nuts. It cannot bring about these changes. And it can't renew itself because it's a one-trick pony. It knows wealth. It knows war. It knows control. It knows the introduction of violence. It knows how to divide, but it doesn't know how to renew. You think about it. Wolin suggests that individuals who come together, who pull their powers together for low-income housing or worker ownership of factories or better schools or better health care or safer water or control over toxic waste disposals, all these common little concerns of ordinary lives, these people are experiencing a democratic moment and, quote, are contributing to the discovery, care, and tending of a commonality of shared concerns. Without necessarily intending it, they're renewing the political by contesting forms of unequal power that democratic liberty and equality have made possible, and that democracy can eliminate only by betraying its own values. This points again to the problem of individualism and localism and my church, my group, my people, my religion, blah, 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 focusing there. Now, you've got to respect my rights and privileges. Well, no, I don't. And no one else does either. You have to negotiate that. You have to work together with others to discuss and negotiate. And I'll get into this in a little more detail later. One of the great examples that Wolin draws upon is the Polish Solidarity movement. And you think about who all was pulled together in that. All these completely different people who really didn't have a lot in common except wanting to make a change. Yet socialists, priests, teachers, artists, true believers, atheists, nationalists. And as Wolin points out, one of the meanings of solidarity is, quote, community or perfect coincidence of interests. So it's not that we have to level everyone out until we're all equal and have exactly the same ideas, beliefs, and powers, is that we bring our ideas, beliefs, and powers into the world of discussion and argument and talk. But this is so bloody hard to do, is it not? There are so many barriers to this. Even if you can bring your politics together. I was listening just this morning to a review of the democracy, the Occupy movement, which was just a few years ago, 5 years ago. The Occupy movement, which was ignored by the mainstream media until they started beating it up and talking about how crazy and useless it was, which Fox News was all over, from early on. But they had an idea. And part of it was theater, part of it was real politics. But it was an idea presented in a forum that could highlight issues, but not bring enough people together to resolve them, to fix them. And it's unlikely that groups like Solidarity or the Bundys, and I'm not suggesting they're in any way equitable, in any way equivalent, but it's hard to imagine these people actually could get control of any meaningful levers of government other than the ones we all have. Okay, there are a couple of libertarian constitutionalist sheriffs, including the one apparently in Grant County in Oregon. But if the state and the powers that be within the state, those vested groups of power interests, the oligarchs, the entrenched politicians, the party apparatchiks, if those people were really interested in the voice of the ordinary folk, if they were really interested in democracy, in a word, then we wouldn't have the suppression of votes that we see. We wouldn't have the crushing of dissent that we see. Did we all forget that folks actually went to prison for giving George W. Bush the state of Ohio by rigging voting machines? I mean, has that slipped our cultural memory? Well, I know America Pravda is not bringing it up, or the loss of the votes for Sanders, or, and that would have been in California, New York, Arizona, Utah, other places where stupidly large amounts of votes just went missing. I'll get back to this in a minute. But right now, it is that time of the show when I get to say something nice about some people I like. And I'm going to do it now. Support for Long Waves comes from Stage Left Theater, 108 West 3rd Avenue in Spokane, and featuring now A Piece of My Heart by Shirley Lauro, directed by Heather McKenna Crutch. This is a powerful true drama of 6 women who went to Vietnam, 5 nurses, and a country western singer booked by an unscrupulous agent to entertain the troops. It's playing October 14th through the 30th. You can get tickets for $10. More information is available at 838-9727 and online at Spokane, stageleft.org. So, let's get back to the meat at hand. I said earlier in the show that modern authority, that modern democracy is antithetical to this notion of individualism. And truly it is. Truly it is. One of the great hooks for Donald Trump is he holds up this idea of the individual who did it his way and got what he wanted. Well, if you've got enough money and are sufficiently void of scruples, then you can pretty much get your own way. It's not terribly hard to hire teams of lawyers to shut people up. It's really not. And so again, this pageant of American democracy unfolds. The Democrat who promises all that people want but won't be able to deliver on most of it, and meanwhile will have her own overseas agendas, the agendas of the military, the agendas of the weapons contractors, the agendas of the banks, all of whom are very strong backers. And we have the Republican who appeals to the basest emotions anger, fear, hate, xenophobia, homophobia, shattering, throwing gasoline on the possibility of any kind of coming together. Democrats pretend they're coming together, but that's just until they're elected. And the Republicans, or Donald Trump anyway, is not even bothering to pretend. Not even bothering to pretend. So, the backdrop of this is a politics of fear and distrust, an anti-politics in which, Henry Giroux writes, the obligations of justice and responsibility to others have been overtaken by a propaganda of fear. The propaganda of fear, indeed. The critical project of democracy, he writes, if not citizenship itself, is replaced by an enforced quietism, obedience, and a state of emergency that eradicates political freedom, democratic process, and legality as such. The dual state, where you have the government we're all voting for, and then the government that really runs things, the deep state, the dual state, the dual state. And so we continue merrily on our way. Let me key up something else here. See, this focus on individuality is not about pluralism. It's not about allowing all folks to achieve a place at the table, all folks to have a voice. It is saying, I'm getting mine and I'm leaving. That's the Bundys. That's the Constitutionalists. That's the Tea Party. I'm getting mine and I'm leaving. I don't care what you need. I don't care what you want. I've got mine. Okay. So what does this do? It triggers reactions from the state, but it doesn't engage other people that it should engage. It should engage other people who would come together and express this heterogeneity and to express how incommensurable so much of what everybody wants is, finally. Because what this does, as Chantal Mouffe points out, this valorizes differences. And it should have no limits. Notice how the people on the right in particular want to eliminate whatever is different. But it is precisely this negotiation of differences as relations that allows people to change how power affects them, how they are subordinated, or how they are raised up. It's through seeing the pluralism of the people around one. The people around one. And this can't be brought about by the state. The state can't produce equality, which is a bad thing because it pretends that the state alone, or the state primarily, can change people. But we are a multiplicity of identities without any common denominator. And, Mouffe continues, it is impossible to distinguish between differences that exist but should not exist and differences that do not exist but should. So, we tend to think of political power, in other words, as taking place in government. We tend to think of political power as taking place behind dark doors where people scribble notes and then shred them and make all of these decisions. But that's not real power, and it's certainly not democratic power, and it's not social power. Power is not external to us. It is not external to the person not external to myself and to the person in front of me with whom I am trying to make my point. Power constitutes both of us. Power constitutes the person I'm talking to, and it constitutes me. And there is no standpoint, there's no place we can go to get out of that. We're all caught in social webs of power. And negotiating those social webs of power is politics. Doing this publicly is politics. It's not saying get rid of power. It's how do we use power to transform things? But we have to give up this what Mouffe calls the illusion that we could free ourselves completely from power. This is specific to the project that we have called radical and plural democracy. It's not that we will finally eliminate domination and violence, as she puts it. But we can set up institutions and indeed, create institutions and indeed move the institutions that exist. Move the institutions that exist to contest and argue what our power is. But we can't do that. We can't do that if we stay focused on this idea that politics is going out and voting. That's not politics. Politics is an ongoing revolution, an ongoing discussion, an attempt to negotiate and change where one is in power. And yet, many Americans seek to expand their own rights through the exclusion of the rights of others. You can't use that toilet. You can't get married. You got to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Oh, it was just a black man we shot. That was nothing. These expressions of power reveal the mistake of thinking that power lies anywhere else but in the struggle for identity and rights of others. Gay, Muslim, black. We have, in many Americans' eyes, no common denominator. But perhaps, in fact, we do have a common denominator. And that we at least have the idea, and indeed the liberty to engage, not to make everyone equal, not to eliminate all domination, but to negotiate wealth, deference, power, privilege, minority. That, my gentle listeners, is democracy. And that concludes today's show. I'd like to thank you so much for listening to me today. This has been Long Waves Radio with Gary Krug. You can follow me on Facepalm, Facebook. I'll get it in a minute. And I will be posting the bibliography for the readings of today's show. You can also catch links to the podcasts of shows. Give me about 24 hours to get this one up. You can email me, longwaves@kyrs.org. And so it goes. I got to do one more thing before I get out of here, and that is, if you've got a car, truck, or boat that you want to get rid of, it's easy to do. You call us. You call 855-KYRS-CAR, 855-597-7227, arrange a free pickup. You get a tax deduction you can use in January. Your car goes away, or your truck, or your boat, so you get that thing off your hands. And we get some pennies that helps us keep the lights on. And I would like to thank everyone who donated or contributed or became members during our fall pledge drive. Thank you so much for supporting KYRS and this show and all the volunteers who work here. I'll be back next week with another show. And until then, I'm going to remind you, you are listening to KYRS, Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 FM. Have a great week and negotiate.